Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the higher and lower nature of human beings. So when I was a small child, I was really shocked to discover that human beings were animals too. We just seemed so different from them that I had a hard time putting two and two together. Now, we do have many differences from animals. We also have many similarities as well. But I think that one of the main differences between human beings and animals is that animals basically have a singular nature. They have their animalistic nature, their instinctual nature. Basically whatever their instincts tell them to do, that is what they're going to do. Whereas human beings, I would say that we have a dualistic nature. We have that animal nature, just like animals do, but then we have our higher nature that has a lot of different variations depending on what society you were born in, how you were indoctrinated. Basically, it's the part of us that is civilized. So we have what I call a lower nature and a higher nature. Now, one thing about the lower, more animalistic nature and the higher, more civilized nature is that, they're both just as natural. So I think a lot of people make the mistake of looking at animals and saying, okay, well, animals, of course they're being natural. And, us human beings, we've strayed far away from nature. Look at our civilizations and look at all of our technology and look at all of these things that we've created. That's so far away from nature, when in reality, it's just an aspect of our higher nature. It's just as natural. It's just a different type of nature from our more baser instincts like animals would have. All right, so in a moment, I'm going to get into a metaphor for how the higher and lower nature work together. But before I do that, I wanted to define some terms that I'm going to be using throughout the video just to clear up some confusion. Alright, so the first term that I want to define is libidinal energy. Basically, this is like life force energy. And it is an erotic energy, so it has to do with sexuality, but at the same time, it's not expressly sexual. It can be many other different things. And in fact, it's really the creative principle within us. It's the thing that makes us go toward things that we want. And, it can be sort of like our inspiration to do things in general. So if we start a business, let's say, and we get really into that, that would be driven by libidinal energy. Or if we have a relationship that we really, really want to make a great relationship, we can also apply libidinal energy to that. So basically, it's the thing that makes us go forth to what brings us joy and passion. So it is an erotic energy in the sense that it's life-giving and creative, but it's not specifically erotic in the sexual way. Another term I want to make sure you're familiar with is the term transmutation. Basically, in the context that I'm going to be using this term, I'm using it in the sense that you're going to be taking the libidinal energy from the lower nature and transmuting it upward so that it can be used by the higher nature. So you're basically taking something that's one way and you're switching it out to be another way, almost like if you've ever converted any files on the computer, you're changing something from one form to go into another form to be used in a different way. So if I'm using the term transmutation in relationship to libidinal energy, what I mean is to take the energy of the lower nature and to bring it upward so that it's usable for the higher nature. Another term that's sort of similar but a little bit different is the term exultation. And exaltation basically means to take something that's lowly and of the earth and to bring it up to a divine level. So basically, when I refer to exaltation with regard to the higher nature, what I mean is to take something that's fairly mundane, and to build it up in such a way that it's at its highest potential. So almost in a sense like self-actualization or trying to reach the pinnacle of what you can achieve as a human being. Alright, so to give you a more solid picture of how the higher nature and the lower nature work together in the individual human being, basically I want to borrow a metaphor from Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Happiness Hypothesis. And in the book he used the metaphor of there being a rider on top of an elephant. And now I'm using his metaphor a little bit out of context. Basically, he used this metaphor to describe the relationship between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, where the conscious mind is what the rider represents and the unconscious mind is what the elephant represents. And ultimately, he said that in order to live a life of happiness, ultimately, your rider has to be in charge of the elephant. So basically the subconscious mind is kind of like the powerhouse, where it has all of these different things going on with it. And the conscious mind doesn't have as much power as the elephant, so it can't do quite as much. But if you can train your elephant to obey the commands of the conscious mind, the rider, then you'll be able to do a lot of great things, because your rider and your elephant will be working as one. They'll be integrated. Now in this video, I'm not talking about the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, but I think that this rider on top of an elephant example is a really good metaphor for the dichotomy of the higher nature and the lower nature. So the rider in this case would represent the higher nature, and the elephant would represent the lower, more animalistic nature. So with the higher nature, with the rider, again, it doesn't have a lot of power, but it does have ideas, direction, and specificity. So it's basically our more civilized aspect. It's our more, it's the part of us that has better judgment in a sense. But when it comes to the elephant, in this case, the lower nature, that's where all the power is. That's where all of the ability to really conjure up energy to be used by the higher nature can come from. And it's really our connection to nature. So ultimately, what you're going to be doing in order to be able to have your higher nature and your lower nature work together as one, you want to integrate the rider and the elephant. So your rider is going to be in control and leading, and your elephant is going to be following. So one way to run into a disaster is if the elephant is actually doing the leading, because the elephant doesn't really have a sense of direction on its own, at least not in the metaphor anyway. Now the metaphor might not be that perfect, but basically you want to make sure that your rider is leading the way, because if you let your lower nature lead, that can basically turn out quite disastrous. So you're always going to want the higher nature to lead, but to basically have a well-trained lower nature to basically bring that energy up to be used by the higher nature. All right, so I want to look at the higher nature in depth first, and then I'll go into the lower nature after. So basically, our higher nature is the part of us that adapts very, very quickly, because it's the part of us that adapts to a society. It's our more civilized part, and if it is properly exalted, it can be quite humane, and it can have lots of great ideas. So ultimately, it's a little bit difficult to characterize the higher nature, because everybody's higher nature is quite different. Because our personality is really an aspect of the higher nature. And we can notice that the higher nature would be different in one society as compared to the next. So it really depends a lot on how you're indoctrinated, what you learn, education, that type of thing. So the higher nature basically creates ideas and ideals to its highest ability. So if the higher nature is properly exalted and brought to its highest form, it'll start valuing certain things that are just very, very healthy for human society. So it'll develop positive social structures, it'll value positive human inventions, positive values, so it'll start valuing things like fairness and nonviolence and compassion. These types of things will just become very, very self-evident if the higher nature is properly exalted. Now, of course, most people's higher natures are not exalted to their highest. Most people are pretty much in the middle with it. And so basically what happens is that you get kind of mixed results. Some things are positive and maybe some things are negative. And so that's why I think that this is a really, really important topic, because I feel like a lot of people don't know how to get good results in life. And so ultimately what you want to do is you want to make sure that your lower nature that has all the energy is in proper alignment with all of your goals and all of your higher nature type of things. That way you really have the energy and the power source going directly toward the things that you want to manifest into your life. And the higher nature is really, really interesting to me, because it's basically the part of us that evolves generation to generation. And so it's almost like there's that saying that, People are great because they've stood on the shoulders of giants. So basically, we're drawing on insights about the higher nature from all of the generations past. So we can look back on an Einstein, or on a Plato, or on some other great thinker like that in history, and we can actually take their knowledge, have that in our mental Rolodex, and then we can move forward and we can build new things off of that. And so I think that that's a really, really interesting thing about the higher nature that really makes us very unique from other animals, because that part of us can always be growing, and it doesn't take that long for it to grow. And I think it really has a lot to do with the growth of the intellect and our understanding about our place in the world and how societies run. And I personally get really, really excited about the potentials of where things can go for humanity in the future. But basically, on the collective level, everything that's an outgrowth of civilization is an aspect of the higher nature. And on the individual level, it's really our personality and our skills and all of our identifications together that make up the higher nature. So it's a really, really interesting kind of phenomenon to be able to live. And what's so cool about the higher nature is that it doesn't really have an upper limit. Like, it extends all the way up to the divine. So you can develop yourself in such a way that really there's no ceiling. There's always more to learn. There's always more that you can tap into. So it's a very interesting thing about being human. Now, the lower nature, which is represented by the elephant in our metaphor of the rider and the elephant, basically that's our more animalistic, instinctual nature. And it's the part of us that has evolved very, very slowly. So again, I said the higher nature evolves very quickly, basically huge changes every single generation, and maybe even huge changes within a single lifetime to the higher nature. But the lower nature stays the same for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It evolves very, very slowly, just like all other animals evolve slowly. And the lower nature is most concerned with things like survival, procreation, homeostasis, getting its needs met. It's also the part of us that's deeply connected to nature. It's a very earthly kind of thing. And this is actually where our emotions reside too. So, there are a lot of very important things going on. And ultimately, it is the power source for us. It's where all of our libidinal energy sits in waiting. So ultimately, if you wanted to use that libidinal energy towards some kind of higher nature kind of thing, you would have to take that energy and bring it upward, to be used toward other things. Now, you could also use libidinal energy in a way that's more like the lower nature. So, for example, procreation would be an example of a way you could use the libidinal energy toward a lower nature kind of thing. But with the higher nature, you could also bring it upward, and you can create things, and you can come up with great ideas, these types of higher nature type of things. Now, I think it's really, really important to cultivate the proper relationship to the lower nature. So ultimately the lower nature can be quite dangerous and has been demonized quite a lot in society over the past 5,000 years or so. But when it comes to the lower nature, I sort of think of it like electricity. So electricity can be quite useful if you have the right relationship to it. But if you use it improperly, you could shock yourself and get seriously hurt. So that's kind of like a caveat I'm going to offer you for the lower nature, is that the lower nature ultimately can be quite dangerous because it is so powerful. So the ultimate goal here for people who are trying to tap into their hidden potentials and to reintegrate and become whole is ultimately to have a relationship between the higher and lower nature where they're really moving as one, so they be completely integrated. So if we go back to our metaphor, the superior strength and stamina of the elephant should be paired with the superior direction and goal setting of the rider, and are ultimately brought together toward one goal. And then from there, you can exalt that to its highest. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a clear channel from the lower nature to the higher nature, so that libidinal energy could travel its way upward. So I'm going to give you some examples that really show this relationship. So one of my favorite images to invoke with regard to the higher and lower nature would be the image of the tree. So ultimately, what you have in a tree is you have the trunk. That would be like our channel, right? And then you have roots that go really deep in the ground, and then you have branches that stretch really high up into the air. So basically, you want to think about the roots as being like the lower nature, and you want to think about the branches as being the higher nature. So ultimately, what the goal is for the tree is to take as much nutrients from the soil and bring it upward toward those branches, so that ultimately those branches can produce leaves and eventually fruit. So the fruit is the goal, but the higher and the lower nature both work in service to that goal. So again, it's the matter of bringing basically the roots are in the dirt, so it's very lowly, it's very earthly, but it's bringing the nutrients of the earth up toward a higher aim. So like our tree example, we also have the chakra system. So the one that's most popular here in America, is the one with the 7 chakras that go up the spine. And they start at the root chakra, so just like the roots of our tree. We have our root chakra, which is at the very bottom. And this is representative of something that like the lower nature would be concerned with, because it's concerned with survival. And then it goes all the way up through the higher chakras, all the way to the crown chakra, which is our most divine. So it's a similar kind of idea where all of our power source lays in wait down at our root chakra, at our sacral chakra, which is concerned with sexuality, procreation. And then we also have our solar plexus chakra, which has to do with concerns of the self, like self-esteem. So those are our 3 lowermost chakras, and those are the types of things that the lower nature would be most interested in. Again, that's our power source, so it has all the libidinal energy there. And ultimately, the idea in the chakra system is to create a clear channel up through all of the chakras so that you can bring the energy all the way up from the base of the spine up through the center channel to the crown chakra, where it can basically be met by divine energy. Now, when that libidinal energy that's laying in wait in the root chakra gets woken up, and goes up through that center channel, what that's called is a Kundalini Awakening. So basically, what the mythology around Kundalini Awakening says is that there's a snake coiled 3 times around the base of the spine, and that when it gets woken up, it's able to go through that entire center channel and meet the god Shiva. So it basically creates a channel from our more earthly aspect up to our most divine aspect. And esoterically speaking, what the snake usually represents is our earthly nature. And so whenever you see a risen snake in any kind of mythology or any type of religious text of any kind, if you see a risen snake, normally what it means is when our lower nature gets exalted to its highest. So basically our earthly nature becomes divine. And that's why pharaohs used to wear those headpieces where they had the risen snake there, because it was basically because the pharaoh was seen as God, literally God incarnate. They were both man and God in one, and so that was what the snake was meant to represent. Now, just a snake crawling around on the ground, that would be an archetypal symbol for the lower nature just in general. And over the course of the past, 5,000 years, there's been quite a stigma against the lower nature. And so because of this, the snake was like the main bad guy in the creation story. So ultimately it was seen as the force that tempted Adam and Eve to stray from God. And so basically there's a lot in the Father God religions. There's a lot of sort of anti-earth kind of sentiments, and so it makes sense that the earth would be, the snake would be the bad guy in the creation story, because ultimately they had an antagonistic relationship to the earth, where they saw earth as basically this place where basically it's like the testing ground to see if you're deserving of going into heaven. and really, anything earthly and instinctual is kind of looked down upon. And, even like I live in America, like a lot of the puritanical sort of ideas, still trickle down even to today. So it's very interesting to see, how the lower nature is viewed just by being able to see maybe how the snake is treated or seen in a particular myth, So it's really interesting to look out for those little esoteric clues. Also, the number 666 is the number of the beast. So again, like they were very, very clear that, the beast should not lead. And it makes sense coming out of those particular societies because ultimately the society had to be very strict for them to survive. They had to be just a specific way. And so if somebody let their instincts run away with them, ultimately it could lead to issues with survival. So ultimately the lower nature was demonized for a reason. But, we can also see the lower nature pop up in different ideas throughout history, like, for example, in Sigmund Freud's id or in Plato's appetites. But ultimately, what we're looking for here is to create a channel between the lower nature and the higher nature so they can both get expression, both be integrated. But there are some barriers to the integration of the lower nature and the higher nature that really need to be addressed in order to know how to successfully integrate them. Alright, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the barriers for the lower nature first because a lot of the ones that have to do with the higher nature directly relate back to it. So I'm going to start with that. Alright, so the first main barrier to the integration of the lower nature would be direct repression of the lower nature. So repressing the emotions and the instincts. So I'm going to read off a quote from Carl Jung. It says, "Too much of the animal disfigures the civilized human being. Too much culture makes a sick animal." Now again, we have a huge history of demonizing the lower nature and looking down upon it. Like I had mentioned before, in the Father God religions, where we saw earthliness as being quite negative, and so we would look at aspects of our lower nature, like our instincts and like our emotions, and the way that they responded to that was to say, oh, well, that's a sin. Let's get rid of that. Let's repress that down. We don't want to see that. And ultimately things are a lot better today with that because our society can ultimately be open enough to handle those things. It's not going to make our society come apart. But there's still subtle attitudes that still hang out to this day. And you can see this when people look down on the body, look down on sexuality, or look down on the emotions as being a weakness, or they value the mind over the body or the mind over the emotions. So these are really clear signs of an issue going on. Now, because we've had such an anti-instinct sort of mentality for many thousands of years, there's also the backlash to that. So, there's, of course, nowadays we go very far in the other direction as well, but it's not really balanced out. See, we have, on one hand, we have extreme repression of the sexual nature and of the instinctual nature, and then we have the exact opposite as the reaction against it. So we have it imbalanced in both directions as a reaction to one another. Now what happens when we lose our connection to the lower nature is we become listless because we lose our power source. So we become very low energy and we get kind of lazy. Because like I said before, the majority of our power comes from our lower nature. And so if we don't have a connection to our lower nature, ultimately this is really like squeezing things tight to where we can't really get any of that libidinal energy to be transmuted upward. So ultimately a person who represses the lower nature will be maybe experiencing a lack of willpower, lack of passion, lack of direction in life. And just won't be able to really be tenacious enough to hold on to actually reach their goals. People who are out of touch with the lower nature also might get depressed and, might start repressing their sexuality as well. Now, on the other side of the horse, instead of having repression of the lower nature, we have obsession with the lower nature. And this is something that I experienced personally. And this is whenever you can build up libidinal energy in the lower nature and you can accept it as it's there, but you have a hard time bringing it upward to be used in other higher faculties. So basically what had happened is that prior to my awakening experiences, I was basically a walking ball of willpower. So essentially if I had a goal, like I could always achieve it. And I was always working really hard, and I was really big into skill building and making sure that I was like the most optimal person. And I think as a teenager, it was also really important for me to do that, all of these kind of self-building exercises. And then when I had my awakening experiences where I saw beyond ego and I wasn't able to lie to myself any longer, it became very crystal clear to me that I was using that sort of willpower to sort of cover over a lot of pain that I had. But then also in not having those tendencies, I was able to sort of tap into other things like my instinctual self. So I felt very, very connected to my more animal nature as much as I did connected to the divine. So when I came out of that experience, I thought that the reason why I was in so much pain and repressing so much was because I was doing all of these skill building things. And I thought, well, if I could just stop doing that, maybe I could be back in that state again. And so what I did was, instead of actually transmuting that energy upward, what I did was I closed off the possibility of that energy coming out through those self-building exercises. So if I were to assign it to a chakra, it would be the solar plexus chakra, all very concerned about self-building. But ultimately, I had repressed that away, so it had to come out in even lower chakra ways. So the sacral chakra, which was very geared towards sexuality, and the root chakra geared towards survival. And after that point, I was having a lot of issues with poverty in my life, and I was also like having a lot of dysfunctional sexual things coming up. So, and I think a lot of people have this same problem, and I call it getting stuck low, so ultimately all of that libidinal energy that you have, it's not able to actually all travel upward toward higher means, so it feels like these lowly ways are the only way for you to get fulfillment and gratification, and on their own they're just not that fulfilling or satisfying. So again, it becomes a matter of being able to have the correct relationship to the lower nature and the libidinal energy that it has, because otherwise, you could very easily end up going the opposite direction of progress, because sometimes these things work in sort of unusual ways. So ultimately, what I was experiencing during those experiences of ego transcendence, I was experiencing like love and all of these higher nature thing and insight and connection to the divine, and so I thought, oh, let me not do that self thing, and so like by blocking that off, I basically cut off any kind of channel for that lower nature, the libidinal energy from the lower nature to travel up in that direction. So it's very important to get the proper relationship to the lower nature. So for someone who doesn't, let's say, have the right relationship to their lower nature, there can be all kinds of weird dysfunctions that come up, like like weird sexual dysfunctions, like fetishes and various other kinds of hang-ups, or you can even have trouble with money because you feel like things are more scarce. Now, one thing that I see really often with regard to obsession with the lower nature is that there are a lot of young men who tend to fall into this trap. So they'll get into the trap of becoming addicted to pornography, or get really like hyper focused on being a man or being alpha in some ways. And so these are kind of an outgrowth of obsession with the lower nature, because if you're focused toward those things, then you can't necessarily bring that energy upward if that's where you're going to put your focus at. So what I think is going to be the most positive for those guys in that situation is ultimately to start those self-building exercises, and not necessarily based around their lower nature, but something that's, takes that same energy and builds something else from it. But women fall into it too. Like I said, I fell into it as well. And one of the ways that it manifested for me was just like I started to define my value only in relation to my sexuality. and it became like a really huge problem because like all of the stuff that about me that was like individualistic and all of those other kind of self-related things, you know, because I was repressing those, it's like that was what I defaulted to, like having my sexuality being my main value. Also, it tends to produce a very low level of sexuality where it's basically like the main thing is using sexuality to get validation of your own existence in the world. And, you know, so that can become very, very unhealthy very quickly. So it's really more of like a fetishization of sexuality than actual genuine healthy sexuality. And I personally call this like getting stuck low or getting stuck in the beautiful nasty place because, you know, it in some senses it is beautiful because it has that passion to it, it has all that energy and it's exciting. And, you know, the thing is it's like it can be comfortable to stay in because there's that pleasure, but there's also pain and it's also very draining to stay low with it. And so like you can very easily get stuck there and get comfortable. And it has this, what I would call tepidness to it. Like, so if you've ever taken a shower that was nice and hot and it was nice and refreshing when you got in, it felt like a relief. But then you spent too long in the hot water and then you just feel yucky after a while. Like that's kind of how the beautiful nasty place or getting stuck low is like. You feel that kind of drained feeling. But either way, whether the libidinal energy, the lower nature, is being repressed and so that libidinal energy can't go upward, or you know you're having the libidinal energy and you're fully in touch with it, but it's just not going anywhere upward, you know, either way it's an issue of repression. But whether you're talking about a repression of the lower nature or an obsession with the lower nature, ultimately what happens is that it produces dysfunction because that libidinal energy can't actually flow upward toward the higher nature. Now you might wonder why this happens in the first place. And I think specifically with the lower nature, what happens is that ultimately you're seeking for something from the lower nature. You know, either you're seeking like to repress the lower nature away so you can think of yourself as a good person. And maybe if you live in a more religious society, you know, you want God to see you as a good person, you know, basically the being a good little boy or a good little girl kind of idea, you know, or, you know, what you're seeking for in the obsession with the libidinal energy. You know, you're looking for some kind of fireworks, some kind of ecstasy of some kind. But ultimately, when you're searching for these in the lower nature, what you're really searching for is a connection to the divine. You know, so it's ultimately like a misplaced seeking of enlightenment. There was a quote that I heard recently, and I thought it was a really interesting one, and it really mirrored my experience when I had my ego transcendence. So basically, the idea is even when a man goes knocking at the brothel door, you know, what he's really seeking is God, is something to that nature. You know, so basically it's that idea that in trying to repress the lower nature, there's a seeking for God, wanting to seem like good in the eyes of God. And then there's also, you know, like seeking for the ecstasy and the transcendence that the lower nature seems to be able to provide. So again, it's that misplaced seeking that happens. But whether you're seeking liberation through some ecstatic experience of the lower nature or through overcoming the lower nature, you know, ultimately what you're going to find is that it's going to end up like the end of a Mario level where they tell you, oh, your princess is in another castle. You know, so ultimately it can't really be found either of those ways. So it's so letting go of the attachment to the idea that you can find what you're looking for in these things will help release that attachment, helps you get an bit of an arm's length away from it. All right, there are also two main problems that I can see with being in touch with the higher nature. And these tend to actually riff off of the problems with the lower nature because they kind of work in an inverse sort of way. So one of the main barriers to the higher nature is just not building up the higher nature. You know, so ultimately, you know, when it comes to the higher nature, there's no upper limit to how high you can actually develop it. So ultimately, the higher nature can extend all the way up to the divine. That's why it's such a unique thing to be a human, is because the human nature, we can keep developing ourselves and developing ourselves. That's why we have these concepts like self-actualization. But in order to really get your fullest out of the higher nature, you have to do inner work as well as outer work. Like, you have to really work on like what's going on inside here, work on integration, start questioning things, and then out here actually build yourself a strong foundation. So you actually have to learn it, build it yourself, and create good habits. And so the main barrier here to doing that is actually laziness and listlessness and apathy. And of course, from when I was talking about the repression of the lower nature, that's what will happen. If you can't bring that libidinal energy up from the lower nature, whether it be repressed or just stuck down in the lower nature, you're not going to be able to bring it up to the higher nature and actually be able to use it for the things you need to use it for to actually build up your higher nature. And ultimately, for somebody who is stuck in the lower nature, a lot of people who are stuck in the lower nature and obsessed with the lower nature, what'll happen is they'll get into like certain things that are addictions, like things that'll have like basic instant gratification. So, like eating, like let's say overeating, or too much porn, or too much sex, or too much this or too much that. Basically anything taken to an addiction level is what people who are stuck in an obsession with the lower nature might end up in. So it becomes very, very difficult if you're spending all of your libidinal energy on these kinds of things and you're not actually using it for ways to better yourself through the higher nature. If I think back on the example that I gave you earlier, like I said, I used to be a willpower machine before I had my experiences of ego transcendence and decided to repress it. Now I still have an issue with willpower. But the problem is that, if you get some of that, energy stuck low, you're not going to be able to really put as much of it toward your endeavors. Now, one thing I want to mention before I get any further, I've talked a lot about like making sure that you express your lower nature on high. Now, I'm not saying that you necessarily have to be celibate with this. Sex can be a positive thing, especially if you do it like in moderation with somebody that you really, really care about. Now, one thing that I want to offer a caveat about is that I've been talking about like taking the libidinal energy of the lower nature and making sure that it gets a higher expression. Now, that's not as to say that it can't take a lower expression, like sexuality itself would be a lower expression. It's perfectly fine to express that. I'm just talking about mainly don't express it in ways that are specifically draining to you, ways that are addictive. And you can tell when you're addicted to something based on how you feel afterward. If you have this drained feeling, it's because it's taking that energy from out of you and you're basically spending it on things that aren't really that enjoyable to you, and you've just gotten into the habit of doing them, and you're not really getting a whole lot of positive energy back flowing back in. So that's one way to tell, whether or not a certain, let's say, lower nature expression is right for you or not, because ultimately there are valid expressions that come from the lower nature, and sexuality is one of them. All right, another one of the obstacles to the higher nature is a belief that the higher nature is somehow unnatural. Like a lot of people nowadays, tend to think that, oh, we've gotten so far off track and look at all this technology that we have and we're so not natural anymore. We've got to get back to what's natural. But again, like I said earlier on in the video, it's the higher nature and the lower nature are both natural. It's actually not possible for human beings to do anything other than what's natural. So it's very, very important to not simply think that, oh, in order to be natural, I have to behave like, my ancestors did back in the Paleolithic period or something like that, And there's a lot of like diets that sort of center around that idea, like, oh, I have to be this way because that's what's natural, because it's what my ancestors did. It's like, well, human beings have always had a higher and lower nature, so your ancestors were probably adapting just as much, and so it's one of those things that adapting to the environment is what's natural, and because human beings grow quite quickly, that evolution happens really quickly as well. And this can also be especially strong if you're a person who's happened to get a taste of like your actual animal instincts. Like you can actually have a first-hand experience of it, like I did when I was open in that way to experiencing it. And so I became like really, really obsessed with like sexuality, because like it was like, oh, that's actually there. It was just such a powerful feeling, and it had that passion of the lower nature to it. And so I think a lot of times the people who get wrapped up in this idea of being like our ancestors, a lot of it is fueled by that same like getting stuck low in the beautiful, nasty place, like I had mentioned before, and being obsessed with the lower nature once again. So it's a matter of recognizing that, yes, I have these instincts and they're there and they're valid, but then also being able to utilize the energy that those instincts create. So I'm going to give you a handful of steps to follow in order to integrate the lower nature and the higher nature, as well as exalt them both to their highest. All right, so the first step would be kind of to self-diagnose to see if you have any of the problems that I mentioned before. So if you have, like, let's say repression of the lower nature, or an obsession with the lower nature, or you just have an underdeveloped higher nature, or even a resistance to developing the higher nature because you think it's an unnatural thing. So you want to self-diagnose, and sometimes it can be like multiple of these at once because they tend to like play off of one another. And there can even be sort of like parts of you that have one issue that seems contradictory to another part of yourself that has a different issue. So for example, you could both have a repression of the lower nature and an obsession with the lower nature at the same time, just in different ways. All right, the second step after you've kind of self-diagnosed for any of those issues that you might have is to actively look for limiting beliefs or falsehoods that might be keeping you back from actually letting go of those patterns. So for example, if you are fixated upon the lower nature, you're probably fixated upon it because you believe that there's something there to be found. Like you're going to find something that's going to fulfill you in some way. And so if you have that belief that fulfillment can be found in the lower nature, chances are it's going to be a lot more difficult to leave that behind. All right, the third step would be to take time to actually tune into your emotions and the sensations in your body. These are coming directly from the lower nature. So basically your emotions, before they hit the level of mind, appear as a sensation in the body. And so if you can actually notice that as a raw somatic experience, as opposed to getting wrapped up in thoughts about it, it can help you also get some distance from that as well. And if you get in the habit of doing that, it'll help you validate any emotions you might get, which will make your libidinal energy more available to you to use. All right, the fourth step would be to drop any kind of activities that make you feel drained. So these are those addictive activities that I was talking about. So a lot of them have to do with things where you get instant gratification, like drugs or pornography or something like that. Something where you can get like a little stimulation for the lower nature without a lot of effort. So ultimately anything that afterward you feel really listless and tired and like the energy's been taken out of you, you want to kind of let go of that and start doing more activities that maybe might take a little bit more effort, maybe aren't so instant in their gratification, but they'll actually be producing good results for you in life later on. All right, step number 5, once you've taken care of steps 1 through 4, that's when you can start building onto your higher nature. So you want to think about building your higher nature inward and outward. So outward, you want to really create a lot of infrastructure in your life so that you can basically live a nice, peaceful life, so that you have everything, all of your needs met. and you can basically get by and focus more on doing the things that you want to do. So, getting a career that you enjoy, getting good habits like, going to the gym or exercising, doing yoga, these types of things. All right, so the fifth step after you've really done. All right, so step number 5 is actually to start developing the higher nature. Now, you probably already have some of your higher nature already in place, but basically you're going to be focused on building your knowledge base, skill building, making sure that you have a positive infrastructure in your life, so that you can live the life you want to live, like where you have a job that you really enjoy doing and you're financially stable, and then also doing the inner work to make sure that you're emotionally stable and you can have positive states like, happiness and joy and things like that. So you want to make sure that you really have your life set up in such a way that, you can basically have fulfilling experiences. And at this stage in the process, you're really just trying to get the basics down. Unless you already have the basics down, then you can start focusing on really exalting the higher nature to its absolute highest. All right, so after you've started building up your higher nature, then you want to make sure that you're staying centered in your desires and your passions. So again, it's centering back in your lower nature, making sure you have that connection to that power source, and then being able to draw upon that for inspiration. And like I said before, libidinal energy is essentially a creative, life-giving force. So it's that erotic nature, but it's not exclusively sexual, but it's erotic in the sense that it's life-giving. So this is what will give life to your creative endeavors, whether it be a self-creation, a creation of a particular way of living, or a creation of like artwork of some kind, or creation of a family, or a creation of a good relationship. So the libidinal energy can be used in many different ways and be channeled to many different ends. And if you're really interested in the idea of transmuting libidinal energy upward, you can actually look into a lot of spiritual paths, like especially ones that have celibacy as a practice within it, because sometimes there are certain techniques that you can use to transmute that energy upward, like in some kind of a yogic practice. And I know that I used to do the 5 Tibetans every day. And then there was a 6th one that they had recommended for people who are practicing celibacy, and I never did that one, but basically the idea of it was to position yourself in such a way and to focus in such a way that you were drawing that energy upward to be used in other ways. Alright, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below. Also, thank you so much to my patrons. And until next time, keep becoming more you.